The plane was a world of its own. High above the ground, the hum of the engines was like a lullaby soothing the passengers into a comfortable silence. The overhead lights buzzed softly, casting a gentle glow over the rows of seats. People settled into their routines, some reading their books, others closing their eyes or quietly chatting to their neighbors, the usual calm of a flight. Yet something was about to disrupt this peace, something no one could have predicted. In the middle of the aisle, a small boy stood, his small form a sharp contrast against the sea of adults. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, his hands gripping the seat in front of him for balance, his eyes wide with uncertainty. His gaze flickered between the windows and the flight attendants. Walking by, he seemed lost, caught between the world of grown-ups and his own small one. The boy stood there, frozen, unsure of where he was supposed to be or what he was supposed to be doing. A few passengers noticed him, but most were too caught up in their own little worlds to pay him much attention. The flight attendants moved briskly down the aisles, assisting passengers and checking seat belts. But when the boy didn't move, when he remained standing there looking almost out of place in the bustling cabin, one of them took notice. Her eyes narrowed as she watched him, standing right there in the middle of the aisle, disrupting the steady flow of the flight. Without a word, she walked over to him, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her eyes set in a firm gaze. The boy was now looking out the window, lost in his own world, or perhaps hoping for something more. The flight attendant stopped in front of him, hands on her hips, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You need to sit down now," she said, her tone sharp and unwavering. The boy's eyes flickered to her for just a moment, but he didn't move. His feet stayed rooted to the spot. He was too small, too innocent to understand the seriousness of the situation, or maybe it was just fear that kept him from reacting. "Now," she repeated more forcefully this time. The passengers, who had previously ignored the boy's presence, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The tension in the air was rising slowly but surely. A few heads turned to look as the boy didn't respond. Instead, his wide eyes just stared back at her, his little lips parted as if he were about to speak. But the words didn't come. The flight attendant's patience began to fray. She could feel the eyes of the cabin on her. They were all waiting for her to act, waiting for her to make the situation right. The boy's face was pale, his tiny body trembling just a little. It was as if something deep within him told him he should not be standing there. Something had made him freeze in place, a kind of terror that made him too frightened to move, too scared to sit down. The flight attendant stood her ground, her eyes searching his face for some kind of answer. But she got nothing, not a word, not a movement, nothing but silence. And that silence filled the cabin like a thick fog. Then the boy spoke in a voice so quiet it almost didn't reach her ears. "I can't sit down." He whispered the words, barely audible in the hum of the airplane. The flight attendant blinked for a moment as the boy's gaze turned away from her and instead looked out the window again, his small hands clutching the armrest in front of him tighter. The silence that followed felt heavier now, more oppressive, his words lingering in the air like a strange kind of tension. Something was off, something was terribly off. "I can't sit down," the flight attendant repeated in her mind, her brows furrowing as she took a step closer to him. "What do you mean you can't sit down?" she asked, though she could already feel her own heart rate picking up just a little. The boy remained silent for a moment, his gaze never leaving the window. But then he spoke again, his voice softer now, barely a whisper. "My mom is—" His words trailed off his face, paled, his eyes wide with a strange kind of fear that she hadn't expected. The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment as the boy's words hung in the air. Between them, his gaze still fixed out the window, his small hands clutching the armrest tighter. The words he spoke didn't make sense at first. The boy couldn't have been older than 6. How could he know about something like that? How could he understand enough to make such a cryptic statement? For a second, the flight attendant almost questioned herself. She blinked once, twice, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't normal. Kids didn't say things like that not without a reason, not unless something was terribly wrong. But before she could process the thought, she noticed the boy's face again, the pale complexion, the wide, fearful eyes that stared at the window, as if trying to escape into the endless sky outside. The unease in her chest deepened. It was as if the words had unlocked something inside her, something she couldn't quite place, but instinctively knew was important. Something about the way the boy looked at her, something about his silence, screamed that something wasn't right. She knelt down to his level, trying to meet his eyes, trying to make him see her face clearly. Her voice softer this time, as she asked again, "Where's your mother?" Her words were deliberate, each one heavy with concern, and more than a little uncertainty. It wasn't just a question anymore, it was a plea. The boy shifted his gaze slowly back to her, his lips trembling. He didn't speak immediately, his small hands still gripping the seat like a lifeline. It was as though he was gathering the courage to say something too terrible to speak aloud. "She's in the back," the boy whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. His words trembled on the edge of something dark, something that made the flight attendant's heart skip a beat. "She can't move." His eyes dropped to the floor, as if ashamed to say more, as if revealing the truth would break something inside of him. The flight attendant's mind raced. She took a quick glance down the aisle toward the back of the plane. There was no sign of anyone who looked out of place, no sign of any distress, but something in her gut twisted, sharply telling her to act now, to not wait another moment. Without another word, she straightened up, her eyes scanning the cabin quickly, her fingers brushing over the call button as her thoughts screamed at her to make sure the boy's mother was okay, to make sure nothing was wrong, to find out the truth before it was too late. The boy looked up at her then, as if sensing her movement, his face pale, his lips trembling with something like fear, or perhaps anticipation. "Please." The boy whispered, "I need to go back to her." There was a strange desperation in his voice now, an urgency that sent a chill crawling up her spine. She glanced at the passengers around them. They were all staring now. A few of them looked unsettled by the exchange. Some even looked away, unsure how to react. It was as though the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted from the usual hum of a flight to something heavier, more tangible. The flight attendant hesitated for just a moment before she took a deep breath and made her decision without a second thought. She turned and walked quickly toward the back of the plane, her heart racing with every step, her mind full of questions, too many questions. She didn't have the answers to, not yet, not until she saw for herself. But as she moved toward the back of the plane, her every step seemed to echo louder in her mind, and the further she walked, the more she felt that something was wrong, something was terribly wrong, and she was walking straight into it. The flight attendant moved with purpose, now her heart racing, her footsteps quickening as she neared the back of the plane. The low hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background as her mind fixated on the boy's words, the boy whose face had been filled with fear and concern, his quiet voice still ringing in her ears. She had no idea what she was walking into, but she knew she had to keep moving. Something deep inside her told her that whatever she was about to find was something she couldn't ignore. She reached the last row of seats and paused for a brief moment, taking in the scene. Before her, the cabin was quieter. Now the chatter had died down, and the usual clinking of trays had ceased. There were no sounds, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning, and the distant roar of the engines above. The lights flickered slightly, but nothing felt out of place, nothing except for the woman slumped in her seat. Her face was pale, almost lifeless, and her body was unnaturally still. Her hands rested limply in her lap, and her head lolled to one side, her posture all wrong for someone who was simply sleeping. The flight attendant's breath caught in her throat as she took a cautious step closer to the woman's side. The closer she got, the more she could see the faint bruises that marked her skin. They were subtle, at first hidden beneath the collar of her blouse, but they were there, and they told a story she wasn't ready to hear. The flight attendant knelt beside the woman, her eyes scanning her face. The woman's lips were slightly parted, and her breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. The flight attendant reached for her wrist to check for a pulse, her fingers trembling as they pressed against the woman's skin, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. But the pulse was weak, barely detectable. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, as she realized the gravity of the situation. The woman wasn't just ill, something was very wrong. The flight attendant's mind scrambled to process the information she had just received. She needed help. She needed to call for medical assistance immediately. But as her hand hovered over the call button, she felt a wave of dread wash over her. What if she was too late? What if the woman's condition had been ignored for too long? What if she was in real danger, and no one had noticed until now? She glanced at the boy, who was still standing in the aisle a few rows back, his small face peering over the seats, his wide eyes locked onto hers. The desperation in his gaze was unmistakable. He had known something was wrong long before anyone else had seen it, long before she had even begun to suspect that something was off with his mother. The flight attendant turned back to the woman, her breath catching in her throat. As she checked again for signs of life, she gently shook the woman's shoulder, trying to rouse her. But there was no response. Her heart sank further as she realized the terrifying truth. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just an illness. This was something far worse. The flight attendant's hand moved swiftly to the call button, her finger pressing it firmly this time. The sense of urgency in her movements palpable. She spoke into the intercom as calmly as she could, but even she could hear the tension in her voice as she requested immediate medical assistance. She had no idea if the woman could be saved or what had happened to her, but there was no time to waste. As the seconds ticked by, the flight attendant stood there trying to hold herself together, trying to stay calm. As she glanced back at the boy, who was now watching her with wide eyes, the same fear she had seen in his face before, still there lurking just beneath the surface. And she knew then that the mystery of what had happened to his mother was only just beginning. The call button blinked steadily above her head, the soft but insistent light casting a shadow on the flight attendant's face as she waited for a response. But the seconds dragged on too slowly, and the silence grew heavier around her. The intercom crackled in her ear, but no one answered, and for the first time since she'd stepped onto the plane, she felt a surge of panic creeping in. She glanced back at the boy, who was still standing in the aisle, his eyes locked onto her face, filled with a mix of worry and something else that she couldn't quite place. But she didn't have time to analyze it, not now, not when the woman in front of her was barely breathing, her pulse so faint it was almost non-existent. The flight attendant's hands shook slightly as she pressed the call button again, this time more urgently. She could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears as she waited for the response that wouldn't come. Every passing second felt like an eternity, and with each moment that ticked by, the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier, the sense of dread growing stronger. There was no time to waste. The woman's condition was deteriorating, and every second was critical. But the cabin was eerily quiet now. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as though the entire plane had fallen into a kind of suspended animation, a strange calm that didn't match the chaos she felt building inside of her. She glanced up at the other passengers, who were all too quiet too. Still, they hadn't noticed what was happening. No one had even acknowledged the woman slumped in her seat. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do next, but everything seemed to blur together, her thoughts tangled in a haze of confusion and fear. She couldn't leave the woman's side, not now, not when it was clear that she was in serious trouble. But she couldn't ignore the boy, either, the way he was watching her with those wide eyes filled with fear and concern. Without thinking, she turned to the flight attendants nearest her in the aisle and whispered urgently, "I need help. I need to get someone back here now." But they only nodded in acknowledgement and continued on their rounds. As if nothing was wrong, the flight attendant's frustration grew. She needed them to understand the seriousness of the situation. They couldn't just keep walking past her as if nothing was happening. A cold sweat began to form on her brow as she stood there at the back of the plane, her eyes flicking back and forth between the woman and the boy who still stood in the aisle, his gaze never leaving her face. The tension was unbearable. She was trapped in a moment between doing what needed to be done and realizing that no one was going to help her. The boy's voice broke through her thoughts like a knife cutting through the fog. "She can't breathe," he said so quietly that she almost missed it, but the words were like a shock to her system, and she immediately turned her full attention back to the woman, her eyes scanning for any signs of life. Sure enough, the woman's breathing was even more shallow now, her chest barely rising and falling, the color draining from her face. She was fading fast. The flight attendant's heart hammered in her chest as she leaned over her, checking once again for any sign of a pulse, but there was nothing. In that moment, she knew with a terrible certainty that something had happened, something that had been hidden from everyone around them, something that the boy knew but couldn't explain. But the mystery was now taking on a new, darker edge, and the flight attendant knew one thing for sure: she had to act quickly, or they would lose her for good. The silence in the cabin was almost deafening. The only sound now was the shallow rasp of the woman's breath, barely a whisper, as she struggled for air. The flight attendant's hands moved quickly but desperately, her mind racing as she checked the woman's pulse again and again, each time coming up empty. The woman's skin was cold to the touch now, almost lifeless. The flight attendant could feel panic creeping in, but she fought it down, focusing on the task at hand. She needed help now, but there was no time to wait, no time for the medical team to board, and no time for the rest of the crew to catch up. She had to do something, anything, to save this woman's life, and she had to do it alone. The boy's voice broke through the fog of her thoughts again, this time louder, more insistent. "She's not okay," he whispered urgently, his eyes wide with fear, his small hands clutching the seat in front of him so tightly his knuckles were white. The flight attendant glanced up at him once more and saw the same look in his eyes that had been there since the moment she'd first noticed him. The terror, the desperation. It was as if he knew something no one else did. She looked back down at the woman's face, and suddenly everything seemed to click into place. Something about the boy's words, something about the way he had been acting, everything pointed to one horrifying truth. But she couldn't say it, not aloud, not yet. It felt too unreal, too impossible for her mind to fully accept. But in that moment, she knew that whatever was happening here was no accident. Whatever had caused the woman's condition, it had happened deliberately, and the boy had known it all along. Her eyes darted to the back of the plane, once more her mind searching for answers. She needed to get to the bottom of this. She needed to figure out why this was happening. But there was no time to investigate, no time for anything other than survival. She glanced again at the call button, but before she could press it, a loud bang echoed from the cockpit, followed by a strange scraping sound that made her freeze in place. Her heart skipped a beat, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She had heard that sound before, but never in this context, never on a flight that was supposed to be routine. The passengers around her shifted uncomfortably. Some of them looked around at each other confused. Others appeared to be growing nervous, but no one said anything. The flight attendants on the other side of the cabin seemed oblivious to what had just happened, lost in their own duties, unaware of the mounting tension in the back of the plane. Then the boy spoke again, his voice trembling. "It's happening now," he whispered, his gaze locked on the flight attendant, as if he could sense her thoughts, as if he could feel the change in the air. His words sent a chill down her spine as she realized that whatever was going on, it was escalating fast. The plane suddenly lurched forward, and the sound of the engines seemed to change pitch just slightly, like they were struggling to keep up with something unseen, something that none of them could control. The flight attendant's breath caught in her throat, and her pulse quickened. She had to get back to the front of the plane. She had to warn the other crew members. But she couldn't leave the woman like this, not when she was so close to slipping away completely. Her hand hovered over the woman's chest once more as she tried to steady her nerves, But as she looked down at the lifeless face in front of her, a chill ran through her body. The woman's eyes were open now, staring at her, unblinking and empty, as if they were just waiting for something that was about to come, but what? The flight attendant's heart pounded louder. Now a sick realization began to take root inside of her. The woman was no longer with them. She had already slipped beyond the point of no return. But the mystery wasn't over, not yet, not by a long shot. And the flight attendant had a sinking feeling that the worst was still to come. The cabin felt smaller now, the air thicker, as if the weight of what was happening was pressing down on everyone all at once. The flight attendant could barely breathe herself, her eyes darting around trying to make sense of the chaos that was unfolding. She knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening had escalated far beyond anything she could handle alone, and yet she had no choice but to stay here, no choice but to face it head on. The boy's eyes never left her face. They were filled with something she couldn't quite name, but it was unmistakable. The fear in his gaze was so raw, so unfiltered, that it was almost like he was pleading with her, begging her to understand something that she wasn't ready to understand, not yet, not until it was too late. The woman's body remained unnervingly still. The air around her felt colder now, her skin more clammy. The once faint bruises on her neck had darkened and spread like ink across water. Her chest barely moved with each breath, and the flight attendant's stomach turned as she realized with increasing horror that this wasn't just a medical emergency. This was something much darker, something far more sinister than anything she had ever seen before. She glanced back at the cockpit, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts all tangled together. Was there a threat on board? Was someone trying to hurt them? Was this an act of terror, or something even worse? She had no answers, only questions. And the more she looked at the boy, the more she realized that he had the answers, but he wasn't telling her. He couldn't tell her, not yet, not until it was all too clear. Suddenly the plane jerked violently, and the flight attendant lost her balance. For a moment she gripped the armrest to steady herself as the low hum of the engines grew louder. But there was something wrong about the sound now. It wasn't the steady roar of a normal flight. It was erratic, like something was malfunctioning deep within the plane, something that didn't belong. The other passengers stirred now, murmuring softly to each other, their anxiety rising as the plane seemed to dip slightly, the sense of unease in the air thickening to the point where it was almost tangible. People were beginning to realize that something wasn't right. They could feel it in the way the plane moved, in the tension in the air. But no one said anything out loud. They were all waiting for someone to take control, waiting for the crew to assure them that everything would be fine. But the flight attendant couldn't offer them that comfort. She couldn't give them any kind of certainty, because inside she was just as scared as they were. And the longer the boy stood there watching her, the more she understood that something had gone terribly wrong, something that could no longer be ignored. She took a shaky breath, her mind still spinning, but she couldn't let it overwhelm her, not now, not when she had to make a choice. The woman in front of her was fading fast, and the flight attendant knew that every second counted. But the boy's words echoed in her mind again, the same words, the same warning he had given her before. It's happening now. Her heart raced in her chest, her fingers trembling as she pressed the button on the intercom again. Desperately this time, her voice cracked slightly as she spoke to the other crew members. I need help back here now, it's urgent. But as the words left her mouth, she realized with a sinking feeling that no one was coming, not in time, at least, not before whatever was about to happen did. The plane shook again, more violently this time, as though something deep inside it was struggling to stay airborne. The lights flickered and dimmed for a moment, casting the entire cabin in an eerie half-light, the sense of impending doom in the air so thick that it felt like the world was holding its breath, and the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming would change everything forever. She turned back to the boy, who was still watching her with those same wide eyes, the terror in his face now unmistakable. He wasn't just afraid, he was warning her, warning everyone. But no one was listening, and the question that lingered in her mind was clearer than ever. What did he know, what had he seen, that no one else could understand? The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows across the cabin as the plane dipped slightly, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each passing moment. The flight attendant's breath came in shallow bursts as she watched the boy, who had been standing still in the aisle, his eyes locked onto hers. Like a warning sign, the terror in his face deepening, as though he knew something was coming that no one could stop, his small body trembling with fear. The low hum of the engines seemed to grow louder in her ears, now a constant drone that seemed to vibrate through her chest with an unsettling force. It was like the entire plane was vibrating out of control, as if it had been taken over by something beyond their understanding. And the flight attendant couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening was somehow connected to the woman at her feet, the woman whose breath had grown so shallow that it almost seemed as if she had stopped breathing altogether. She glanced at the boy again, his eyes wide and searching, as if he were begging her to see the truth, begging her to understand that this was no accident, no ordinary medical emergency. He knew something she didn't, and in that moment she felt the weight of his gaze like a heavy burden. The panic in her chest threatened to overwhelm her, but she couldn't let it. She couldn't afford to fall apart now, not when the passengers were starting to murmur anxiously among themselves, and the strange sensation of something terrible hovering just beyond their reach was becoming impossible to ignore. The flight attendant swallowed hard and forced herself to focus. She had to act now. She had to find out what was happening before it was too late. As she turned back to the woman, the reality of the situation hit her like a punch to the gut. The woman's body was as cold as ice, her skin pale and clammy, her pulse so weak that it was nearly impossible to detect she was no longer breathing. And yet there was something deeply unsettling about the way her eyes were open, staring blankly into nothingness. The flight attendant knelt down beside her again, checking her pulse again. But there was nothing except the empty stare that seemed to follow her every movement. And it was in that moment that she understood the terrible truth. The woman was gone, but not in the way she had expected, not in the way a normal death would have looked like. This was different. This was something unnatural, something that no one had prepared for. Her mind raced back to the boy's words, "She can't move," and the chilling realization that his mother had been trapped in some way, trapped in a state between life and death. And now that same darkness had claimed her. The flight attendant felt her heart beat faster as she thought about the boy's cryptic warnings and the strange behavior of the plane, the bizarre way it seemed to lurch and shake, as though it was trying to escape something unseen. But there was no time for second guesses, no time for doubts. The flight attendant's instincts kicked in, and she grabbed the woman's shoulders, shaking her gently, trying to rouse her from whatever state she was trapped in. But there was no response, no reaction, except for the stillness that had settled over her. The panic began to spread among the passengers. Now, as they started to realize that something was wrong, that the flight wasn't normal anymore, the sense of unease in the air was palpable, the whispers among them growing louder. The flight attendants who were walking by now noticed the tension in the cabin, and they began to move more quickly, their eyes flicking nervously toward the back of the plane, but still no one stepped forward to help. The flight attendant felt the cold sweat on her brow as she stood there, trapped between the body of the woman who was no longer truly alive and the boy whose eyes were filled with unspoken terror. She knew something had changed. She knew something was wrong. But what was it? And why couldn't anyone else see it? And then, without warning, the plane lurched again, this time with more force than before, a violent shaking that made the walls creak, and the passengers screamed in fear. The flight attendant's heart pounded in her chest as the world seemed to twist around her. She felt the grip of reality slipping away, and in that moment the truth was impossible to deny. Something was happening, something that none of them could control, and the worst was still yet to come. The plane shook again, this time violently enough that the overhead compartments creaked and a few bags fell to the aisle. The noise was deafening, but in that moment all the flight attendant could hear was the pounding of her own heart. The fear was overwhelming, but it wasn't just the turbulence, it wasn't just the unexplainable shaking of the plane. It was something far deeper, something more sinister, that she couldn't put into words, not yet, not until she understood it all. The boy's eyes were wide now, his hands clenched tight against the seat in front of him, his knuckles white, the terror on his face unmistakable. But there was something else in his eyes, something that made the flight attendant freeze in place, something that whispered of an understanding she wasn't ready to accept, not yet. "Mommy," the boy whispered, his voice trembling so softly that it almost got lost in the noise around them. But it was loud enough to reach the flight attendant's ears, and in that instant she felt a chill run down her spine. It was a word filled with so much emotion, so much loss. But it was more than just grief. It was something that carried a weight of finality, a weight that pressed down on her chest, as if it were suffocating her. The boy wasn't just scared, he wasn't just reacting to the situation. He was mourning something deeper than she could see, and in that moment it became painfully clear the woman wasn't just sick or unconscious, she was something else entirely, and the boy had known it all along. She turned to look at the woman's face again, and the horror that filled her was nearly unbearable. The woman's eyes were still open, but now they had changed, they had darkened. They were no longer filled with fear or pain. They were empty, a hollow emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. And it wasn't just her body that had changed, it was her presence. The air around her had become colder and more oppressive. The very atmosphere had shifted in a way that she couldn't explain, but could feel deeply. The flight attendant took a slow step back, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, of what was happening around her. But nothing made sense, nothing about this was normal, and she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach that told her they were in far greater danger than anyone could imagine. The boy's gaze never left her, his eyes pleading now, as if he was trying to communicate something that was beyond words. But the flight attendant couldn't understand him. She couldn't make sense of what he was trying to say to her. She only knew one thing for certain: something had happened to this woman, something beyond her control. And whatever it wasn't just affecting her, it was affecting the entire plane. Suddenly, without warning, the overhead lights flickered violently, and the plane lurched again, this time with such force that several passengers screamed, and the entire cabin was plunged into darkness for a moment that felt like an eternity. The only sounds were the frantic gasps of the passengers and the sudden whir of the engines cutting out momentarily. The air was thick with fear and confusion. The flight attendant's mind raced as she fumbled for the emergency lights and turned them on, casting an eerie red glow over the cabin. She had to act, she had to get the crew involved. But she couldn't leave the woman, not like this, not when something was so clearly wrong. The boy's voice broke through the tension again, his whisper so soft, and yet so intense. "It's too late," he said, his words hanging in the air like a curse. And in that moment, the flight attendant realized the terrible truth. The woman hadn't just died, she had been taken over by something that was now threatening the entire flight, and there was no way to stop it. The feeling in the air was shifting again. It was becoming heavier, and the temperature in the cabin had dropped drastically. The flight attendant's breath misted in front of her face, and she could see the same mist forming around the woman's body, as though it was alive. And the worst part was she knew she couldn't fight it. Whatever this was, it was beyond anything they could control. The boy's eyes met hers one final time, and for the first time since this had all started, she saw a flicker of understanding in his gaze. He knew this wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just an accident. It was something planned, something that was coming for them all. And the only thing she could do now was brace herself for the inevitable. The plane lurched again, and the lights flickered one last time before the cabin was plunged into total darkness once more.